Good morning. You can tell that the Senate is in charge because we're already 20 minutes late. My name is Mike Rounds. I'm from South Dakota. Each year, the National Prayer Breakfast provides an opportunity for us to come together, Republicans and Democrats alike, and pray for the success of our nation. For 70 years, the Prayer Breakfast has been a place where we set aside politics and focus on what binds us together, not what divides us. The tradition of the National Prayer Breakfast dates back to President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who at the time confided in one of his close friends, Senator Frank Carlson, that the White House was the loneliest house that he had ever lived in. Senator Carlson responded, "Mr. President, I think this may be the right time for you to come and meet our prayer group." And that's just what the president did. In this group, he found individuals who were willing to offer their nonpartisan support for our president, the leader of the free world, because they knew that's what was best for our country. The job of the president is not easy, and you often find yourself in the midst of difficult political situations. However, as the president, you should still be able to count on our prayers for the success of our country. This event allows us to recognize our common bonds, to offer our prayers for one another, our president, and our nation. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand and I are here together in this effort. We both understand what our founding fathers believed in: the right of each of us to worship the good Lord the way that we see fit, whether it be in a church, synagogue, mosque, mountaintop, temple, or cathedral. We believe that all are welcome here in our country and in the spirit of Jesus to this prayer breakfast. Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Can you pull that? Yeah. Good morning, everyone. It's been my honor to be co-host of the National Prayer Breakfast this year, and it's my honor to welcome you all here today. I want to start by thanking Senator Rounds for his partnership in putting this event together, and I want to thank all of you for being here to worship with us, to lift up the President and the Vice President, and to heal our nation. Gary Jobe and Cody Carnes are multi-Grammy-nominated worship leaders and songwriters. They're married and they live in Nashville with their 2 boys. I'm personally a huge fan of their music because each song is rooted in Scripture. You'll listen to the words of the music and you'll hear something and say, "Oh, I know where that's from. It's from Revelations." Or, "I know where that's from. It's from 1 John. That's why their music is such a gift. And the special gift to this gathering is that Carrie is starting with her famous song, "The Blessing," which has become a worldwide anthem during the pandemic. It's already been translated into 140 languages. If you know it, please feel free to sing along. Carrie and Cody.
Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen. 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 The Lord bless you and keep you. Make his face shine upon you and be gracious street, the Lord turned his face toward you and give you peace. Amen, amen. 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 Thank you, God, for every promise. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his presence go before you and behind you and beside you, all around you and within you. He is with you. He is with you in the morning, in the evening, and you're coming and you're going, and you're weeping and rejoicing. He is for you. He is for you. He is for you.
God is for us. What can be against?
Oh, thank you, God. Thank you, God. And amen. Amen. Amen.
I would now like to invite up to the podium Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock and Congresswoman Kathy McMorris Rogers for our opening prayer and our opening reading. Reverend will go first.
May we bow our heads to our hearts. And I saw a great multitude of men and women, boys and girls, diverse in their humanity, hailing from the four corners of the earth. They looked into each other's eyes and they were not afraid. And the answer came, "This is the kingdom of God imbued with love and justice." So I asked, "Where is this?" And the answer came, and the angel said, "When we learn the simple art of loving each other as sisters and brothers." Oh, gracious God, we are grateful for the covenant we have with you and with one another, inscribed in Scripture. Of one blood, God has made all nations to dwell upon the face of the earth, that we might seek after God, and yet God is not far from any one of us. the covenant codified in our charter documents, captured in the phrase e pluribus unum, out of many one, in the blood of those who had the courage to confront tyranny from without and injustice from within. Teach us, O gracious God, how to love one another. This is what love looks like in public. Bless now our president and our vice president. Give them your peace that surpasses understanding. Bless their families, and through them and us, may all the families of the earth be blessed. We ask this in the name of the God who loves us into freedom.
A reading from the Old Testament, Proverbs 3. Tablet of your heart, then you will win favor and good name in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him and path straight. Blessed are those who find wisdom, those who gain understanding, for she is more profitable than silver and yields better returns than gold. She is more precious than rubies. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her. Those who hold her fast will be blessed. The word of the Lord.
Good morning. Oh, come on. Good morning. Your remarks this morning. Leader Schumer and Senator McConnell, thank you. Clergy, colleagues, friends, welcome to this 2022 National Prayer Breakfast. It's a blessing to be back together representing criminal defendants through his Equal Justice Initiative, which provides free legal services to the unjustly convicted. Thanks to its work, at least 125 haven't read Brian's book, Just Mercy, or seen the movie based on his work. You're in for a powerful experience this morning. Brian was born in Milton, Delaware, where his parents raised him and his siblings to be deeply rooted in their faith and taught them at an early age the power of prayer. His father, Howard, instilled in his children the conviction that faith is the evidence of things unseen. His upbringing in that faith fed his determination to see injustices undone. When I first met with Brian a decade ago in Montgomery, our first conversation, yes, was about his years of determined and hard work exonerating the innocent, but also his stunning vision for how our nation could more honestly confront the legacy of slavery, of lynching, and of segregation. We spent hours talking late into the night as he described for me a vision of a national monument to the terror of lynching, a memorial, a nationwide series of markers, and a community-based effort at reconciling and repairing the harms of decades of domestic terrorism rooted in racism. Years later, in 2018, his National Memorial for Peace and Justice opened in Montgomery. I've seen firsthand this powerful memorial and its impact on our home state of Delaware, where the history of our most notorious lynching has now been both confronted and memorialized as a result. And last year, the Equal Justice Initiative opened the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, confronting the history of racial inequality from slavery to modern-day mass incarceration. As Brian has said, our nation's history of racial injustice casts a shadow that can't be lifted until we shine the light of truth on the destructive violence that shaped our nation, that traumatized people of color, and compromised our commitment to the rule of law and to equal justice. For all of us, our faith is an important part of what comforts us and sustains us and helps us engage with others in these difficult times. but it is also a charge, a call to see and to address injustice in our nation and world when and where we see it. For his leadership rooted in faith, confronting our nation's original sin of slavery, Bryan Stevenson has been recognized far and wide. He has a hopeful message for us about how we can make both mercy and justice real in our nation. Let's listen for his word. Bryan.
Thank you, Senator Coons, for that very kind introduction. I'm so thrilled to be here, thrilled to have this opportunity. It's a special privilege to be here with the Vice President, with whom I can now proudly claim to be a fellow alum of the great Howard University here in Washington, D.C. It's also just an extraordinary honor for me to be here with the President, with whom I share a deep and abiding love for our beautiful state, the first state of Delaware. And the President, thank you, that's our Congresswoman over there. And it's great to be here with all of you, to the leaders of the Senate, the leaders of the House. I don't envy elected officials. I don't. There is power, there is prestige, there is status. But I know that these positions also come with judgments, with criticism, with attacks, and sometimes they are unfair. And we read in the Gospels, the 12th chapter of Luke, that Jesus said, "To whom much is given, much is required." And we understand that with leadership comes responsibility. With status comes accountability, but that doesn't mean that when you're being challenged, when you're being attacked, that it doesn't weigh on your heart, that it doesn't burden your mind, that it doesn't undermine the things that keep you healthy in your spirit and in your soul. And it's especially true in difficult circumstances. And I don't think anyone can deny that we're living in the midst of very challenging circumstances right now. Nearly 800,000, over 800,000 Americans have died of COVID in the last 22 months. Nearly 6 million people across the globe have died. Tens of millions of people on this planet have suffered all of the tragic consequences of this terrible pandemic. Businesses have been disrupted. Families have been separated. Challenges have been created. And it's easy to begin to feel overwhelmed. I come from places where I work and live and spend time with the poor, the accused, the incarcerated, the condemned. I've spent my life in the company of the disfavored, the excluded, the marginalized. And I can tell you that when you are pressed and you're dealing with all of these challenges, it's actually difficult to not ask questions of God. And the question I want to ask this morning is, what does God require from us in this moment? How do we manage all of these overwhelming challenges? These were questions that were put to the prophet Micah during his time. The leaders then wanted to know what God required from them when there was so much difficulty around them, and they proposed that they could give God gold and silver. They could give him offerings. Some even offered their heirs, and what Micah reminded them is that God doesn't want any of those things. He says in the 6th chapter that what God requires is that we do justice, that we love mercy, and that we walk humbly. And this morning, I want to talk about what I believe is necessary for us to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with God, because I've spent time on death row, because I've spent time in places where people are struggling and have fallen down. I've learned something about what doing justice requires. And what I believe that doing justice requires is that we get proximate, get closer to those who are experiencing injustice. We cannot do justice if we are unwilling to go to the places where cruelty and oppression are manifest, where abuse of power is manifest, where suffering is manifest, because it's in proximity to those who are excluded and neglected, those who are suffering, that we begin to hear things that we won't otherwise hear. We see things that we won't otherwise see. I think proximity is key to doing justice. We understand the power of proximity in medicine. We wouldn't have a vaccine to this COVID virus unless our scientific researchers had pulled apart the nature of that virus with such intimacy that they could find a way to inoculate us, to immunize us. Business leaders know that to be successful, you have to understand demand and supply. You have to be proximate to the factors that are going to allow you to succeed. In education, we understand. In medicine, we understand. But sometimes I think we doubt that justice requires that kind of proximity. And I'm here today to make the belief, to make the argument, to make the prayer that God wants us to stay proximate, to stay close, to get close to those who are suffering, those who are neglected, those who are marginalized, those who are struggling. I'm the product of someone's choice to get proximate. I grew up in a community where black children could not attend the public schools. I'm here because lawyers made the uncommon choice to get proximate to poor black kids like me. I started my education in a colored school. There were no high schools for black kids in our county when my dad was a teenager. He couldn't go to high school. And even though he was smart and hardworking, he didn't have the opportunities that he could have had we broken down those barriers. But these lawyers came into our community. They enforced the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education. And because of that, I got to go to the high school. I got to go to college. I went to law school. I'd never met a lawyer until I got to Harvard Law School, but I was there because there were a group of people who got proximate to people like me. And what I'm saying is that even in this moment of difficulty and complexity, we have a shared humanity that compels us to stay close to one another. People of faith have a powerful role in modeling what it means to be proximate, to draw near. In all of the great faiths, in the Quran, in the rabbinical studies, there is this urgency around getting proximate to things that matter. Christians are taught that we pray to be kept near the cross. It's at the cross, it's near the cross that we find redemption and salvation. And what I'm saying is that we have to understand that as people of faith, we cannot be separated. We cannot disconnect from those who suffer. My grandmother was very influential for me. She taught me things that I've never forgotten. She was the daughter of people who were enslaved. And the experience of being raised by enslaved people shaped her worldview, and my grandmother was a force of nature. She was tough, she was strong, but she was kind, and she was loving. My grandmother was the end of every argument in our family. She was also the start of a lot of arguments in our family. And when integration came to our community, my grandmother was very worried. She hadn't lived through that before, and she started doing this thing I don't remember her ever doing before, but she started coming up to me, and she'd give me these hugs, and she'd squeeze me so tightly, I thought she was trying to hurt me. And then she'd see me an hour later, and she'd say, "Brian, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she would jump on me again and hug me some more. So by the time I was 10, my grandmother taught me every time I would see her, the first thing I would say is, "Mama, I always feel you hugging me." And she'd smile this smile, and I didn't appreciate what she was teaching me until much later. My grandmother worked as a domestic her whole life. She lived into her 90s, but when she got into her 90s, she fell one day and she broke her hip. And then she was diagnosed with cancer. And my grandmother was dying, and I couldn't imagine being in the world without her. I was a college student at the time, and they told me that I only had one more chance to spend with her, and I went to see her, and I couldn't really reconcile myself to her passing. She was on her bed, her eyes were closed, and I thought if I kept talking to her, she couldn't die, and I just talked and talked and talked. And then I realized I couldn't do this forever. And I was just pouring my heart out. My grandmother wasn't responding. Her eyes were closed. I wasn't even sure she could hear what I was saying. And then I realized I had to go, and I stood up, and I took a step away, and that's when my grandmother opened her eyes. And then she squeezed my hand. And the last thing she said to me, she looked at me, and she said, "Brian, do you still feel me hugging you?" And then she said, "I want you to know I'm always going to be hugging you." And I didn't appreciate the power then, but I appreciate it now, because there have been times in my life when I have felt the embrace of my grandmother. I have felt the embrace of believers who have lifted me up. And I tell you that because we have to understand our power as people of faith to embrace one another, to affirm each other's humanity, to affirm each other's dignity. And you don't just show God's love by embracing those with whom you agree, with whom you spend time. We have to embrace all of God's children. And I think what's missing when we try to do justice is our willingness to sometimes just be present with people who are struggling and suffering, and to embrace them, to show God's love in a meaningful way that affirms their humanity and dignity. But we won't be doing it effectively if we also don't talk about the narratives that create separation. I worry about the narratives that are in our world right now. I do. There's a lot of fear and anger. And when people allow themselves to be governed by fear and anger, they start tolerating things they should never tolerate. They start accepting things they should never accept. I've seen what narratives of fear and anger can do. We have in the United States the highest rate of incarceration in the world, in part because there were narratives out there 40 or 50 years ago that said that people are drug addicted or drug dependent are criminals. When we could have had narratives that said, no, these are people who have illnesses that we need to treat. And because those narratives prevailed, there's a lot of collateral suffering. I see narratives that are fostering violence and bigotry. I hate violence. My grandfather was murdered when I was 16 years old. And whether it's gun violence or gang violence or domestic violence or sexual violence or police violence or aggression of any form, we have to understand that these things separate us from doing justice, from loving mercy. There are narratives in our environment that are contaminants to being the kind of faith leaders that I believe we are called to be. We're in this great space, and there are generations of leaders who occupied this space, who've done extraordinary things in this country. We have been a force for liberation and freedom across the world. We've done extraordinary things to lift up models of democracy and governance that are transformative. But we are also the heirs in this country of a horrific history of racial injustice. We are still burdened by the consequences of bad choices, mistakes that were made. And it doesn't matter where you live in a space where you can still see these pollutants in the air. And some have argued that at some point these contaminants would just dissipate. I don't believe that. I think we're going to actually have to talk about things that we haven't talked about before. My four parents, I'm the child of four parents who were abducted, kidnapped, trafficked to this country in chains. My great-grandparents were enslaved in Caroline County, Virginia. James and Victoria Baylor were forced to labor on plantation fields from the time they were small children until they were teenagers. They were denied freedom. They were denied dignity. They were told all of these things that limited their aspirations. And the worst thing they had to deal with as enslaved black people in this country wasn't the forced labor, but it was this narrative that enslavers used to justify enslavement. They were told that they're not as good as people who are white. They're not as capable, they're not as evolved, they're not as human, they're not as valuable. And that narrative of racial difference created this barrier. And even after the Civil War, members in this Congress created the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. We passed the 15th Amendment designed to protect and provide equality, designed to provide voting rights. And still for decades, we did not enforce those rules. There was this narrative in the air. And for decades, we had lawlessness undermining justice. Black people were pulled out of their homes, they were beaten, they were drowned, they were tortured, they were lynched. And we haven't really acknowledged that 6 million black people fled the American South, and we haven't really talked much about the fact that many of the black people in Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland and New York and Boston did not go to these communities as immigrants seeking new economic opportunities. They went to these communities as refugees and exiles from terror. In the American South, a generation ago, courageous people sought to remedy these issues, and they came together, black and white, Jew and Gentile, and they fought for civil rights, and we made great progress. We passed voting rights laws, we passed civil rights laws, and that opened up opportunities for people like me, but that narrative still persisted. And it breaks my heart that today we still live in too many places where there are these presumptions of dangerousness and guilt that get assigned to people because of their color. And you can be a United States Senator from South Carolina, from New Jersey, from Georgia. You can be a congresswoman from Los Angeles or Houston or Minneapolis, but you can go places where you're going to be presumed dangerous and guilty. And I can tell you, as I'm getting older, that when you have to constantly navigate these presumptions, you get tired. It's exhausting. And what many of us are seeking is the kind of justice that God ordains, the kind of justice that breaks down these barriers. And I think people of faith have a critical role to play in leading our nation, leading the world in truth-telling, truth that leads to justice, truth that leads to reconciliation, truth that leads to restoration, truth that leads to repair. And people of faith know that we can talk about these problems and challenges not because we seek punishment, but because we seek liberation, and the world needs to see modeled that we have the courage of our convictions, the ability to actually talk honestly about our mistakes. I go to a church, and in my church, you can't come to church and say, I want salvation and redemption in heaven, but I'm not going to admit to anything. I'm not going to talk about the bad things. The preachers will tell you that there has to be confession and repentance, and we shouldn't fear that because it opens up the hearts and minds that lead to liberation. I believe there is still something better waiting for us in this country. I can't be persuaded that this is as good as it gets. I think there is still something waiting for us that feels more like freedom, that feels more like equality, that feels more like doing justice. But we will not get there if we do not follow God's call, if we do not tap into our faith and push for the things that we are called to push for. To do that justice, to love that mercy, we've got to get proximate. We've got to change these narratives. But thirdly, we've got to stay hopeful. I'm worried about the absence of hope. I go into communities. I sit down sometimes with 12 and 13-year-old kids who tell me that they expect to be in jail or prison by the time they're in their 20s. And this profound absence of hope is shaped not by things they've heard, but by what they see. I am persuaded that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And so our hope is key to our capacity to represent God's love on this earth. Hope is the thing that will get some of us to stand up even when people say sit down. Hope is the thing that will get some of us to speak even when people say be quiet. Our hope is our power. My great-grandfather James Baylor was enslaved in Virginia, but he learned to read despite the anti-literacy laws that made it illegal, that might have cost him his life had others known that he was reading. And when emancipation came, my grandmother told me that formerly enslaved people would come to their home every week, and my great-grandfather would read the newspaper to give people hope about what they might be able to achieve. And my grandmother wanted that power to read, and she learned to read despite the limits of educational opportunities. She had 10 children. I always asked my grandmother, I said, Mama, why did you have so many kids? She said, I have so much love, and I don't want to leave any love behind. My mother was the youngest of her 10 children. We grew up poor in a segregated, racially isolated community. But my mother went into debt to buy the World Book Encyclopedia so we could see a bigger world than the world we saw outside our house. And it was that hope that made it possible for me to do some of the things I've done. And we have to give that hope to our children, to our young. We cannot be defined by division and conflict. We cannot be defined by this pandemic. We cannot be defined by the forces that preach violence and bigotry. We have to be defined by something transcendental. Something that is rooted in our faith, something that believes that love is preferable to all of the forces that are around us, shaping us and pushing us. And so that's why I'm persuaded that doing justice means that we have to get proximate to those who suffer. We've got to change these narratives that foster bigotry and violence. We've got to stay hopeful, even when it's difficult and challenging. And finally, I am persuaded that doing justice, loving mercy, walking humbly with God means we have to do things that are uncomfortable. We have to do things that are challenging. I wish it weren't true, but I don't see any way around it. Because the truth is that when you model fellowship in this Congress, when you embrace one another in this Congress, when you actually talk about our common humanity, our shared humanity, there will be those who criticize. There will be those who say you're not supposed to do that. And there will be pushback, but I am persuaded that great things only come when great people are willing to embrace one another, to do the uncomfortable. I've spent the last 20-some months in Montgomery during the pandemic, and I've thought about the generation that came before me in that city. I stand on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less. In the 1950s and 60s, black folks in Montgomery, Alabama would put on their Sunday best. They'd go places to push for the right to vote, to push for equality, and they'd be in those places on their knees praying, and they'd be beaten and battered and bloodied, and still they went. I'll end with this. I was giving a talk in a church, and there was an older black man that came into the church, and he was in a wheelchair sitting in the back, and I was giving my talk, but he kept staring at me. He had this stern, almost angry look on his face, and I couldn't figure out, why is this man staring at me so harshly? And I got through my talk, and people came up. They were very nice and appropriate, but that older black man sitting in that wheelchair, he just kept staring. And finally, he wheeled himself to the front of the church, and he came up to me, and he looked at me, and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I didn't know how to respond. And then he asked me again, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I mumbled something. And then he asked me one last time, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And that's when this older man looked at me. He said, "You're beating the drum for justice. You keep beating the drum for justice." And I was so moved. I was also really relieved. I just didn't know what he was going to do. And then that older man grabbed me by my jacket and he pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, come here, I'm going to show you something. And that's when this man turned his head. He said, "You see this scar I have behind my right ear?" He said, "I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama, in 1963, trying to register black people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this cut? Got that cut, Philadelphia, Mississippi, 1964, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise. Got my bruise in Birmingham." And then this man said, "I'm going to tell you something, young man." He said, "People look at me. They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "But I'm going to tell you something." He said, "These are not my cuts. These are not my bruises. These are not my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor. I want to honor every member of this institution that positions yourself in uncomfortable places, that commits to doing justice, that believes that redemption is better than revenge, that healing is better than hatred, that God's love can be manifest on this earth when we do justice, when we love mercy, when we walk humbly with Him. There will be bruises and scars, but today I want you to know that God honors those who take that call. I honor you. I celebrate you. And I thank you for this opportunity to be a part of this beautiful prayer breakfast. God bless each and every one of you.
All right. Very nice. Wow. A very, very powerful message. Brian, thank you very much. And I'll tell you what, as I think about this thing a little bit, just thinking about that grandma hug is something that I think transcends for all of us. Thank you, Brian, for a very powerful message.
I'd now like to welcome the Majority Leader, Senator Chuck Schumer, and the Republican Leader, Senator Mitch McConnell, to come to the podium for a reading.
Good morning. First, thank you, Mr. President, Madam Vice President. Thank you, Brian Stevenson, for that amazingly powerful and inspiring words. And a special shout out to Senator Rounds and my dear colleague, Senator Gillibrand, who I know put her heart, soul, and mind into revitalizing this breakfast. Thank you, both of you, for your hard work. A reading from Deuteronomy, Devarim. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, Adonai our God, Adonai is one. And you are to love Adonai with your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your resources. These words which I command you today are to be on your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children. You are to talk about them when you sit at home, when you travel on the road, when you lie us down, and when you get up. A reading from Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 8. Don't take vengeance on or bear a grudge against any of your people. Rather, love your neighbor as yourself. I am Adonai.
The Gospel according to Matthew. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself.
Show me a man who has endured great loss and still has faith, and I will show you a man who has learned to serve and how to lead. Tell me about the doors that have been shut over and over and over, and I will tell you about a path that has been laid out and well lit in advance. When I think about Joe Biden, our president, of course I think about his years of experience as our president, our vice president, as a senator, and his many accomplishments and accolades. But the experiences that truly shaped the man began as an eldest child in an Irish Catholic family growing up in Scranton, Pennsylvania. A young boy who overcame a stutter and made overcoming adversity and loss the defining aspect of his character. We all know as believers that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. This has never been truer than in the life of President Biden. In every challenge in his life, it would have been understandable to put down one's mantle, give up, and leave it to others. Through all his hardships, he has persisted. He has persevered. He has stood back up. And he has never forgotten God's love for him. He continues to fight the good fight and to keep the faith. We know that God's love prevails and endures forever. God has called every single one of us to be the light of the world, to be the salt of the earth. He's called us to love our neighbor as ourselves. And he's called us to love him with all our hearts. God asks us to rest in him and to not lean on our own understanding. President Joe Biden has done this his entire life, and that is what has prepared him to lead. That is what brought him to a time such as this. That is why he is here, to lead this nation and to heal this nation. It is my honor and privilege to introduce this man of faith and great courage, President Joe Biden.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I don't know who she's talking about, but thank you. Folks, look, let me say, I didn't know I was going to get that kind of an introduction, but let me say at the outset that, we've all gone through really difficult times. Every one of you out there, one way or another. And I had an overwhelming advantage, and I mean it sincerely. I had a family that was there for me every single solitary moment. And so I don't deserve this credit for enduring that so many people I meet. Think of all the people you know, whether they're constituents or friends or relatives, who get up every morning, don't have anybody. They put one foot in front of the other, and they do it. They lost a child. They lost a mother, a father, a husband, someone close to them, just plucked away. And they get up every single day and put one foot in front of the other. And They're the people who deserve our recognition and our credit. I think I've talked to Bill and Grace Nelson about this. The only thing, today is my son Bo's birthday, but the only thing that Bo said to me when we were told he was going to die within minutes or of an hour, that he looked at me and he said, "Dad, promise me, Dad, you're going to stay involved." I said, "I'll be good, Bo." He said, "No, Dad, promise me. Give me your word as Biden that you're going to stay engaged." Because he knew, like a lot of you, what you've been through, the first instinct is you just want to crawl up in a ball and just leave. No longer do what you've done your whole life that he said, Dad, promise me. I give my word. That was the last conversation in Walter Reed Hospital, lying there in the bed. And then he looked at me and said, "And Dad," and his brother Hunt, who was his closest friend. We were all three on the bed. And he turned to me and said, "Dad, I want you to know, I'm not afraid." So, I had so much help, starting from the time that I lost my wife and daughter in that accident. But look, everybody has got horrible things they've had to deal with. And we've watched them I sat in the Senate for 36 years. We watched people literally die in our midst. Remember that scene where Teddy walked out? I'm flattered that you think as highly of me as you stated, Kristen, but I had a lot of help. And I want to thank you for the introduction. It's very gracious, but like I said, there's a lot more people who've done a lot more. And to my good friend, Chris Coons. Two things I tell everybody about Chris Coons you got to know. One, he's smarter than you. And two, the boy can preach. He's the only guy that went to law school and got a divinity degree at the same time. I worry about divine lawyers. But anyway, Chris, thank you. You've been a great friend. And as Brian, as you were speaking, Chuck sort of leaned over. He didn't say anything, but just like, was that Delaware? But it was Delaware. That's why I got involved in politics in the first place. I remember going to a little Catholic grade school in Claymont, Delaware, which was a steel town that was dying. And the bus my mother would drive me to the school parking lot. It's called Holy Rosary School. From it was called Brookview Apartments. It used to be Section 8 housing later. And I get out of the bus, I get out of the car, and this is where I-95 runs parallel to these days. And I said, "Mom, why are all those kids," and it was then called colored, "why are all those colored kids in that bus?" Because in Scranton, there weren't any. There were very few blacks. So they're not allowed to go to school with us here in Delaware. So, and Milton wasn't what you might call the epicenter of desegregation. And so you've been through a lot, but you've done a lot as well. And I thank you. And Carrie Job, you have the voice of an angel, kid. I tell you what, you really do. And that guy sitting next to you, he's a lucky guy. A lucky guy. And besides, he has all his hitter. And Vice President Harris, Majority Leader Schumer, Mitch McConnell. Mitch, I don't want to hurt your reputation, but we really are friends. And that is not an epiphany we're having here at the moment. You've always done exactly what you've said. You're a man of your word, and you're a man of honor. Thank you for being my friend. And folks, members of Congress and spouses, I'm honored to join you all today. We're keeping our prayers for Senator Lujan, and keep him in your prayers today. I think, from what I understand, he's going to be okay and be back with us in not too distant future. But we pray for safe recovery. And a special thank you to the bipartisan chairs of this breakfast, Representative Lamb and Wahlberg, Gillibrand and Rounds. Mike, I know it's been 3 months to this day that you lost Gene to cancer. So you know of which I speak. And it's like losing a piece of your soul. And I remember. Today, as I said, is a day that a lot of us can remember the times when what we lost, each of us. And just like I miss my son every single day, I know he's always with me, for real. He's always with me. Congressman McBath, just like your precious son Jordan, he's always going to be with you, for real. It becomes a piece of you. You know, how many times have you all been through this, about to make a decision, say, what would Bo want, or what would Jill want, or what would, whatever it is. And for everyone out there who has lost a piece of their soul, they're always with you. And all through the pain, I think if you can find purpose of a life that makes you worthy in their eyes of what they expect of you. This breakfast usually is held in a big Washington hotel with a big crowd. Today we're here in the Visitor Center of the United States Capitol with a much smaller crowd. More intimate setting to see each other here and listen to each other, standing in this, which is in governmental terms a sacred place. And think about our former colleagues and close friends we lost in this year: Bob Dole, Harry Reid, Johnny Isaacs, who was a hell of a guy, Max Cleland, Carl Levin, Mike Enzi, John Warner, Walter Mondale. And, I learned a long time ago, never make one good eulogy. Because if you make one good eulogy, you got to do a lot of eulogies. But I've had the pleasure of knowing their families, and there's a lot of good friends, both sides of the aisle, who disagreed on many, many things, who still talk and listen to one another. I think I've said, Mitch and some of you earlier in the last couple of years, that, one of the things I don't know for sure, but I think is missing in the Congress, we don't spend as much time with one another as we used to. We used to eat lunch together. I mean, literally sit down, not in the Senate dining room in the Senate, with that small dining room off to the right across the hall from the visitors' dining room. And there was two big round tables, big dining room tables, and a buffet. And I remember when I first got here, after my wife and daughter were killed in an accident, my boys were still in the hospital. And I remember Teddy would always come and say, come to lunch. I didn't want any part of going to lunch. One day he just dragged me over to lunch. He said, you'll learn more there than any place else. And I would go to lunch there literally every day and listen to the senior members. And you learn about their losses, their happiness. You learn about them. You learn about their, I remember one day I walked in and there was a little corner in the table, or a corner table, when the big table was filled. And I sat and Jim East said, come over here, Joe, sit down here. And I wasn't about to sit in John Stennis' seat. And because he sat at the head of the table. And he said, no, come on, he's gone. So I ordered my hamburger, whatever the devil I ordered, took a couple bites, and then walks John Stennis. And I immediately put a napkin on all my stuff, and I said, I'm finished, Mr. Chairman. Come on, right here. I later got a handwritten letter from him about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I appreciate the honor of you recognizing my seat, but you didn't finish your meal. I promise this favor will be returned. It was returned. He actually endorsed me, and I ran for president from Mississippi. I think that was an expensive hamburger for him. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, when you know one another, and no matter how badly you disagree, and people think, Rev, that in the days that's divided here, we had a lot of flat-out old segregation is still in our caucus. But Teddy Kennedy would argue like hell with Jim Eastland, and then they'd go down and have lunch. Didn't agree with one another, but they treated each other with respect even that day. And I just think that when you learn that another man or woman, you're flying a Codell and someone has their husband or wife with them, and you learn that they have a kid with a problem with alcoholism. You learn that they have a daughter who has breast cancer. You learn that they have. It's hard to dislike the person. And so one of the things I pray for, and I mean it, is that we sort of get back to the place that's so busy. I think things have changed so much. But that we get to really know each other. It's hard to really dislike someone when you know what they're going through, the same thing you're going through. You know, like President Eisenhower, the first president to attend this breakfast 70 years ago, at the time President Eisenhower said, he said, there's a need we all have in these days and times for some help which comes from outside ourselves. Outside ourselves. I've attended many of these prayer breakfasts over the years with our nation at war, in struggle and strife, peace, in times of prosperity when everybody was getting on. But a nation in prayer. Jill and I have been humbled by the prayers of so many of you, and it means everything to us. We pray for our nation as we face an inflection point in our history. So much is going to change, no matter who's sitting in my job. The world is changing. The world is changing. There's the moment, but there's also a moment of great progress, of lives saved in this pandemic, not just the ones lost, new jobs created for people, new hope, rebuilding the nation, but also a moment of pain for the lost lives and the lives that are lost in this pandemic, and the cruel twist of fate that occur. You know, at a moment of great division of our democracy is at grave risk. I pray that we follow what Jesus taught us, to serve rather than be served. I don't always do it. I hope try. I don't always do it. I pray to keep the faith, that the very promise of America, believing that there's nothing we can't do, where every person is created equal in the image of God, no matter who, where we come from, who we are, what our color, or how we choose to pray, or whether or not we choose to pray. They deserve to be treated equally throughout their lives. Faith in the very idea of America that can be defined, in my view, by a single word. I've been saying this for over 30 years. When I get asked to define America, one word: possibilities. Possibilities. One of the reasons why other countries sometimes think we're arrogant is we believe anything is possible. Anything is possible. And faith in the American people will prove each and every day we're a great nation because we're at our heart a good people. We do bad things and we get frightened. St. Augustine wrote that a people was a multitude defined by a common object of their love. I believe the common objects of our love that define us Americans are opportunity, liberty, dignity, respect, honor, service, truth. Things everybody recognizes both here and around the world. As I stand in this citadel democracy that was attacked 1 year ago, the issue for us is unity. How do we unite us again? Unity is elusive, but it's really actually necessary. Unity doesn't mean we have to agree on everything, but unity is where enough of us believe in a core of basic things: the common good, the general welfare, of faith in the United States of America. The United States of America. Nearly 3 weeks ago, we were reminded of that truth. A gunman entered a synagogue in Colleyville, Texas. He took 4 worshipers hostage, including a rabbi, for 11 hours. But violence and vengeance didn't pierce the goodness and grace of that scene. Heroic law enforcement officers were joined by local faith leaders, including an imam, a Baptist minister, who offered their help. Nearby Catholic church opened its doors for the hostages' families. At sunset, a group of Muslim women, friends of the rabbi's wife, walked in with one of the rabbi's favorite foods. They hugged and they wept because of the bravery of the hostages and the law enforcement officers. The hostages escaped safely, and the families were reunited. When asked later if he would change anything, the rabbi said, quote, "We will do what we always do, which is the best we can." Which is the best we can. I had a long conversation with the rabbi. It was interesting to hear him describe the scene and how faith mattered. Whether you're in a synagogue or a church or a mosque or a temple, whether you're religious or not, we're all imperfect human beings trying our best, the best we can, because we can't know the future. We can't know what's coming. We also can't live in fear every step of the way. That's America. From darkness, we've found joy, hope, and light. Rather than driving us apart, faith can move us together, because all the great confessional faiths have the same fundamental basic beliefs. Not just faith in a higher power, but faith to see each other as we should. Not as enemies, but as neighbors. Not as adversaries, but as fellow Americans. As leaders of this nation who work and pray together, there's an oath to God and country to uphold, and a charge to keep, to stand in the breach, and to protect our democracy, to work together to right wrongs. That's how we all came here, to make the most of our time on earth. For if a house divided cannot stand, surely a house united can do anything. And if we do that, I think we'll have done our duty. With history and God watching, we will have to prove that there's nothing beyond the capacity of the United States when we're united. United States. You know, some of the senior senators are here. Used to kid me because I was quoting Irish poets on the floor of the United States Senate. And there's a poem, The Cure at Troy, written by an Irish poet who I got to know. It says, history teaches us not to hope on this side of the grave, but then, once in a lifetime, that tidal wave of justice rises up, and hope and history rhyme. I honestly believe we're at one of those moments. There's so much at stake. The division has become so palpable, not just here, but around the world. We have a chance. We have a chance to make hope and history rhyme, because the rest of the world's looking to us. Every time I'd walk out of my Grandpa Finnegan's house up in Scranton, some of you heard me say this before, he'd yell, "Joey, keep the faith." My grandmother would, "No, Joey, spread it. Let's go spread the faith."